Hi there, welcome back to class. So this is part 4 of the immune system video lecture series. So now we're going to be talking about adaptive immunity or the adaptive immune response. The adaptive immune response responds to specific antigens by specific white blood cells called B cells and T cells that have evolved the ability to deal with certain antigens and make antibodies and then be able to identify our cells that have become infected by those antigens or pathogens. So we have two separate arms of specific immunity or our adaptive immunity that overlap, and those are our humoral immune response and our cell-mediated immune response. So in our concept map right here, we're on this side of talking about the body's defense mechanisms. This is a type of our immune response that takes longer because the cells need to be able to randomly encounter the antigen on that pathogen, or we have certain cells of our own body that actually present that antigen to cells of our immune system. But it can take longer to do that. So we also have all these non-specific immune responses that deal with quite a lot before you would need to invoke this adaptive immune response. But our adaptive immune response can be highly effective for dealing with invading pathogens and cancer cells of our body. So this is our third line of defense, and it has specific responses and memory. And the organs of the lymphatic system are pretty important in terms of this part of our body's defense mechanisms, because those organs, like our lymph nodes and our spleen, house the white blood cells, and they give the white blood cells an area to encounter these pathogens in our extracellular body fluid, or an area where we have the blood coming through, like in our spleen, where those white blood cells can encounter a special kind of cell called an antigen presenting cell. So we have these parts of our immune system that we have talked about. We talked about the first line of defense, which are nonspecific physical and chemical surface barriers. We have the second line of defense, which are our cellular components of our immune system, like natural killer cells and macrophages and neutrophils, the phagocytic cells that are nonspecific. And now we're on that third part of the immune system, which involves our adaptive immune response. So our adaptive immune response is a highly specialized part of our immune system where we have specific cells that are able to make antibodies, which are a protein that can bind with an antigen, which is a protein that is displayed on a bacteria cell capsid or on a virus. And they also have memory, our cells, the lymphocytes that are involved in the adaptive immune response. So that these are long-lived cells that if they encounter that antigen, or if we encounter that specific type of pathogen again, then a secondary immune response can be invoked, which really can deal with that infection a lot quicker then, because we have all of the defense forces, the B cells and the T cells, that can then divide quickly and deal with that pathogen the second time around. So let's talk about those MHC markers a little bit. The MHC markers are our major histocompatibility complexes, and these mark every cell in my body as self. So all of my tissue cells have these membrane-bound proteins that are marking them as my tissue cells. So they're like little ID tags for my cells, like showing the police officer your driver's license. So the cells of the immune system, particularly like T cells, when they bump into a cell of our body, a tissue cell, they can identify what cells are us, ourself, versus what cells are invading pathogens potentially or non-self, so that they can discriminate between those types of cells. One interesting thing is about 50% almost of the living cells in our body are actually not us, are non-self. So this is a pretty important job in our immune system of our T lymphocytes to be able to identify our cells as self or non-self. So here's a diagram of what that kind of looks like. So this would be a normal tissue cell or body cell displaying your major histocompatibility complexes, those MHC markers. And here would be a potential bacteria cell that would be invading us, displaying an antigen on its capsid instead. So an antigen is a relatively general term. It means any non-self substance or protein or an organism that triggers an immune response. So antigens are typically large molecules such as proteins, polysaccharides, nucleic acids. But if you're talking about an antigen, say on a bacteria cell or on a microscopic type of worm or protozoan, they would be membrane-bound proteins that identify that cell, that living cell, as non-self in our body. So the lymphocytes are your B cells and your T cells, and these are the types of white blood cells that are highly specialized to be able to attack certain pathogens based on their antibodies, membrane-bound protein that they would be displaying, or a protein on their capsid that they would be displaying, that the immune system could identify as non-self. So both B cells and T cells form in the red bone marrow. The red bone marrow manufactures all kinds of white blood cells. So these B cells and T cells form in the red bone marrow. But the B cells also mature in the red bone marrow, whereas T cells mature in the thymus gland. And that maturation process, that testing process of developing self-tolerance, is pretty rigorous actually for T cells and B cells, particularly for T cells. So T cells, because there's helper T cells that are like the generals or the, leaders of the army of our immune system forces, they're able to activate all these other cells. So only about less than 5% of the T cells that are made ever leave the thymus gland because they pass the test of self-tolerance. So it's a pretty rigorous school for T cells in the thymus gland. Only about 5% ever being able to become mature T cells. So the T cells are able to recognize those MHC markers, those self markers. And there's actually two types of MHC markers. There's MHC markers that identify that cell, that tissue cell, as self, and then that's MHC complex number 1. But there's also MHC complex number 2. And MHC complex number 2 are the type of MHC complex that an antigen presenting cell can display, where it has both the self marker, so the ID tag, along with the antigen attached to it, so that that T cell can recognize what specific antigen is invading the body. So there are only specific types of white blood cells in our immune system that are antigen presenting cells. and those are dendritic cells. And dendritic cells are the type of phagocyte that hangs out in the connective tissue and cells in our epidermis. And then when they encounter an antigen and engulf it, or a pathogen with an antigen on it and engulf it, then they can migrate to the lymphoid organs like the lymph nodes or the spleen, and then present that antigen to the helper T cell on the MHC number 2 type of complex. We also have macrophages that are antigen presenting cells. So when they encounter a particular pathogen, they also digest that pathogen, and then they put that antigen from the pathogen on their MHC marker and migrate to the lymphoid organs and present that antigen to the helper T cells. We also have B cells that can be antigen presenting cells. B cells can have membrane-bound antibodies too. So B cells can be activated by bumping into a particular pathogen, but typically the way that they would be activated would be by helper T cells that have become activated. But it is possible for B cells to bump into a particular pathogen displaying an antigen, and if they have a membrane-bound antibody that reacts to that pathogen, then they can be activated. So all of those 3 types of cells can present an antigen to a T cell and activate the T cell: dendritic cells, macrophages, and B cells. So B cells and T cells both divide into effector cells, which are short-lived, but they can attack a specific pathogen, and memory cells that are long-lived types of cells that can attack that particular invader and mount a quick immune response the next time that it's encountered. So our 2 branches of our adaptive immune system are our antibody-mediated immune response, or humoral. This branch is specific for defending against antigens that are free in our body fluids, so including toxins or extracellular pathogens like bacteria cells. So once a B cell is activated, then it can become an effector B cell, and it starts pumping out antibodies that are specific for binding to that antigen and can neutralize that antigen. And the other branch of the adaptive immune response is the cell-mediated immune response. And the cell-mediated immune response specifically involves T cells that can develop into helper T cells that can activate the rest of the type of immune response, can activate B cells to make specific antibodies, and can form into cytotoxic T cells. Cytotoxic T cells have the ability to pop and kill, like little assassins, specific cells that have been infected with a specific pathogen, like a virus that has been infected that cell. Because part of the cycle of replication for the virus is to infect the cell, get its DNA incorporated into the genome of the cell, and make viral proteins, and then cause that body cell to pop and explode those new viruses all over our body as it does that and spread the virus. So the cytotoxic T cell can take care of our body cells that have been infected with a virus before they would replicate that virus and spread it. They also can deal with cancer cells. So this is a nice summary flowchart of our immune response and how that works. And this is where we're going to start on our next part of our video lecture series. So this will be the start of part 5. Thank you.